Calaroga Shark Media.
Hello, I'm so excited to share this one with you. I'm Johnny Mack, and my guest today is Des Bishop. He's got a new special. It's called Of All People. We recorded this on Monday, and I wanted to share it immediately. I enjoy this conversation so much, but all the Hinchcliffe stuff was going on, so I kept it here in its normal scheduled Saturday slot. Some stuff about Dez's bio. Grew up in Queens, flunked out of St. Francis Prep, wound up living in Ireland, where he's a very successful stand-up comedian. He also speaks Mandarin and spent some time in China doing stand-up. We'll cover all that. We talk about Tony Hinchcliffe. He'll explain why the dogs are barking and the fireworks, and I just had so much fun talking to Des Bishop. I'm actually glad we rescheduled. We were supposed to record this on Friday, and then you had an issue on your end. And my first question to you is going to be, don't you have a show in 2 hours? Why the hell are you talking?
Yeah. Like, literally, I was driving down and I was like, what was I thinking that I scheduled for this time? But you know what it is? It's like when you're in American mode and you're scheduling, you're not really thinking about Irish time. You know?
Yeah, no problem at all. So that sets up my second question, which is, what is your pre-show routine? I remember, so my career is, I'm really a radio executive, and Jim Brewer used to do Afternoon Drive on the Raw Dog channel at Sirius XM when I was the boss. And I remember the first time I went out on the road with him, he grabbed me, and I'm glad he did. And he said, look, man, before I do a set, I totally shut down. I don't want you to think I'm in a bad mood. I'm not pissed off at you. Just this is just how I roll. So 2 hours before a show, don't talk to me. Of course not. But what do you do?
Well, if I'm driving and stuff, I'm basically just getting there. And then when I'm there, make sure everything's set up. And then I just kind of distract myself. Similar to Jim Brewer, except that I maintained my sanity into 2024, like Jim Brewer. But similar to Jim Brewer, I tell relationships and people that I'm involved with that I can't be around people. If you're expecting me to be a normal person, then you can't be around me because I'm going to be uptight. I'm going to be a little anxious. I'm not going to be the best version of myself leading up to a show.
No, it makes total sense. Since you opened this door, has Tony Hinchcliffe made the news in Ireland yet?
Well, it's hard for me to know if he's made the news in Ireland because I've very much been on top of that story. So, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on all that stuff. Can I just make a quick disclaimer? The reason why, I know that you're not really a video guy, but I'm outside because, fun fact about Ireland does its fireworks for Halloween, not for the 4th of July. And it's leading up to Halloween, so there's a lot of fireworks. So the dog goes insane. So I've had to go outside and leave the dog inside. So you may hear faint barking, but it could be a lot worse. And trust me, when I'm not recording, it's so much worse with me and the dog in the house. But anyway, on the Tony Hinchcliffe front, I mean, where do we start?
So I try not to hang myself on this show. People don't come to this thing for politics. They come for me to speak with comedians. So my take on it, and I'm not a comedian, never been a performer, but studied this enough to, if I break it down just as a joke in no context. For example, during the Subway series, if I go to Los Angeles and I go, hey, there's a floating pile of garbage on an island, it's called Manhattan. If I do that during the World Series in LA, that joke might fly, but in the context and the room it was done, it takes on whole other connotations, and it's really not a good joke.
It's a 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10 joke max. It's dated on top of it. And I'm not one to come after Tony Hinchcliffe, but in the context of the importance of the week and a half that we're in leading up to an election, why you would choose a dated target like Puerto Ricans, because obviously you can, you just did, you can insert whatever island you want onto that joke. It's pretty basic. At the roast of Tom Brady, if they're roasting a Puerto Rican comic that was on the Dace, then you might go, okay, there's a lot of that type of joke at a roast. But when the world's cameras are on you and you're a comedian, and it's fine, you've been hired to make some jokes leading up to it, why you would choose that as your joke? I mean, you want to make that point, you can joke about anything, but it's actually kind of it's juvenile, it's immature, and it's really stupid. I actually think Trump is kind of stupid. So I think that he would never think broad enough to go, maybe I shouldn't have a risky comedian on this close to an election when certain states votes might literally hinge on 20,000 people like it did in Georgia, 22,000 people. He may have shifted enough votes to change a state. That's insane.
Well, I have so many topics I want to get to. You and I are both New Yorkers. We're both from Queens. So you know from the 80s and the 90s, Trump is not like Mr. New York City. He's not going to win New York. I just thought the whole thing, it was a weird choice. Like, go campaign in Pennsylvania. What are you doing in New York City? This isn't going to work.
Well, nothing he does makes sense. And again, we're not going to get too political, but I think for him, he feels he wins regardless. That's what I think. Like, I think Trump thinks, I'm going to win. If I lose, I still can say that it was robbed and my profile is humongous and I can continue with my current grift, which is the voice of the people that feel like they've been marginalized in modern America. So I don't know if he even cares. Like, I just feel like it's a win-win for him. The problem is that the whole political system just deteriorates all around his selfish, notions. And then I'm not a Republican, but the Republican Party continues to suffer. Like, the whole thing it's absolutely crazy how much space and bandwidth has been given over to this ego. And then the Trump people will obviously not agree with me, but I think if you stand back, it's just so clear that it's just about one man. It shouldn't have been allowed to happen.
So we'll put the politics in our back pocket. Before I go quoting a comedian set, did you see Tony's joke about rock, paper, scissors?
I did. And again, I like fine, I guess. But like, read the room. You need Michigan. And actually, I talked to a Lebanese girl recently, and they were like, she's from Michigan. She's from Grand Rapids. And they're not happy with Kamala, the Arabs in Michigan. And some of them, just out of virtue of their own anger towards Kamala, were thinking maybe Trump can sort it out. And then he goes and basically makes it very clear that they definitely do not care about the Palestinians. So again, dumb joke. America, if by the way, if that was in Ireland, he'd be lynched. Like, the
really?
Irish are, you got to, the Irish perceive the Israeli-Palestine conflict in terms of what the British did to Ireland has been done to the Palestinians. And I'm not taking a position, but I'm just telling you that joke would not have flown over here at all.
All right, let's switch over to Queens. One of the things I try and do is not ask the same questions you've been asked 10,000 times. However, your particular story has some interesting curves along the way. Again, Irish kid from Queens. I'm probably 7-8 years older than you. So when we're 12, that matters. But at this age, it doesn't. What part of Queens are you from? I know I'm from Jackson Heights, 87th and Roosevelt. So I know in an interview, they'll say Flushing. But are you from Main Street? Are you down by Booth Memorial? Are you further out? Where'd you grow up?
Further out. I'm nearly Bayside. I'm really right on the border of Fresh Meadows and Flushing, and just west of Bayside. So actually near enough to where Trump grew up. I grew up right off Utopia Parkway. He was a few miles down the road in Jamaica Estates off Utopia Parkway. My mother, though, as a youngster, hung out a lot in Jackson Heights because it was quite Irish back in those days. But I'm very much like a Eastern Queens. I don't like to admit this, but it has more like Long Island vibes than does city vibes,
Oh, yeah, sure. Once you get out past the 7 train, maybe another mile or two now with all the development. Oh, my God, I was on the Van Wyck last week, and I couldn't believe the development in Flushing. But once you get out there, yeah, it's, Queens just kind of softly switches into Nassau. They've renamed it since, but there was like that 10-block stretch where one side of the street was Jamaica Avenue, and the other side was like, no, we're Jericho Turnpike. Like, yes. we're not Jamaica Avenue. What are you talking about?
Well, you pay less property tax when you're on the Queens side. But officially, my neighborhood, by the way, was called Auburndale. So if you're ever on the Long Island Railroad, we're Auburndale Station.
Again, I'm back to Trump. You just reminded me when during COVID, he started talking about walking past Elmhurst Hospital, which is 82nd and Broadway, a couple blocks south of the 7. I'm like, in what world were you walking on Broadway in Jackson Heights, Elmhurst? Never once, dude.
Yeah. And if he walked by Elmhurst Hospital, it was a shit show back then. But honestly, I was there recently because I went to the Met game, actually, and I ended up parking on Junction Boulevard. And we walked from, when we were done, myself and my wife walked from City Field back to Junction Boulevard. And I mean, like, you can travel the world on Roosevelt Avenue. I don't care what anybody says. I actually, the taxi driver that took me to JFK for this trip that I'm on right now, he was a Dominican guy. And he was telling me that he didn't think Roosevelt Avenue was safe. But I told him, I said, listen, man, I walked back late at night, right past Corona Plaza. And I thought the whole thing was exciting, you know, and you really feel like you're in all these different parts of the world as you make your way further west towards the city.
My dad would be so proud of you. So he was a bartender. We're McDermott's. He worked at Blarney Stone. So you know the kind of guy I'm talking about.
Sure.
And he taught me growing up, you don't pay the park. You park over in Corona. And to this day, I'll still park on like 112th and Northern and walk. And I remember when my son was little, he'd be like, what the hell are we doing? I'm like, I'm not paying $30 to park. It's just not what you do.
Well, your dad wouldn't be proud of me because the reason I had to do it was because I got there too late and it was all full. And they were trying to get me to park in College Point at the Skyview. The game had already started. So I said, screw that. I whipped onto the Grand Central. To be honest, I was actually going to park in LaGuardia and get an Uber. But then I was like, nah, I'll park on Junction Boulevard around there and I'll jump on the 7. So that's what I did. But then we walked back.
That's good. Where's Hannah from? Was she like, what's up with Roosevelt?
She's from Brooklyn. So
so it's nothing to her.
Yeah, none of this is too intimidating, you know. But she was from Park Slope, but her grandfather bought that house, so like they're not like fancy Park Slope people. In fact, her dad grew up with Colin Quinn and his family. So age-wise, I fit somewhere between Colin Quinn and Hannah, but Colin Quinn got quite the kick out of the fact that I ended up marrying Dan Berner's daughter because they all grew up together in Park Slope.
Love this guy. More with Des Bishop in a minute. Not to step on your material about your name. When I saw, I was like, yeah, that's an Irish guy. Like I never, I don't want to do the joke, but like I was like, yeah, I know guys named Desmond.
Yes, but I didn't know any Desmonds growing up. That's not an exaggeration on the joke. The only Desmond I knew, which you might have also known, was Desmond's Pub on Park Avenue in like 30-something. I used to always see that and be like, yo, it's my name, because it was such a rare, and obviously Bishop Desmond Tutu, which is, I talk about in the joke. But yeah, honestly, I did not know many Desmonds growing up, but I also was not aware until adulthood that Black people in America consider it a Black name.
I didn't know either. All right. So you're growing up, you're in Queens, you're going to St. Francis Prep. That makes sense now that you've told me where you're growing up.
Yes.
And depending on which article I read, you either got kicked out, asked to leave, chose to leave, got sent to Ireland, chose to go to Ireland. Which version of that is accurate?
I mean, essentially, the majority of those things are true. They can all be true together. Like I absolutely flunked out. You know, if you fail more than 2 subjects, you're not allowed to come back. So I got kicked out. I mean, that's what we said. Like I got kicked out of prep. But obviously when somebody says they got kicked out of a school, it sounds more dramatic than it is. But like I just had a severe lack of interest in school. I mean, there was other things that were going on that I think in the modern day education system, perhaps I would have gotten like more support. But that aside, I did flunk out. My mother was freaking out about what I was going to do. She was really thinking that I was on a bad path. I was drinking a lot, but that had nothing to do with why I got kicked out of school. And then a cousin put the idea in my head and I suggested it to my parents. So I wasn't sent away. I did actually want to go. But at the same time, my parents did allow me to go and did organize it and did do it in out of a fear that I was screwing up my life.
It's an aggressive choice. So to catch up the audience. So you go to school in Queens. If you don't go to public school, if you've got good grades, you're probably going to Malloy. If you've got bad grades, you're probably going to McClancy. St. Francis was like a middle school there.
Well, actually, the St. Francis prep people would not take kindly to you suggesting that prep was below Malloy, because they definitely had equal status in like the eyes of the co-op system and everything.
I apologize to St. Francis.
But that's okay. The difference really was the smart people that were really into women went to St. Francis.
Yes, Malloy was an old boys' school back in the day.
At the time.
But why not?
Chris Stefano went to Malloy, by the way.
Why not drop down to McClancy?
Well, actually, I would have went to Holy Cross. That would have been where I ended up. But I don't know. I never got to the stage where I had to pick another New York school because I really thought the idea of going to Ireland was like really cool, actually. And my mother, see, we had a cousin that was going through some addiction stuff. And my mother really was freaking out that I was going to get in big trouble. So when this Irish thing came up and she looked into it, and it was kind of cheap by relative standards of going to boarding school in the United States, she just had this thing in her head that I'd be safer there. I think that's really what she thought. Honestly, for me, it was a real win because not only did I get a better education because I was away from my distractions, I was in an all-boys boarding school, you get supervised study, but I also got the education of suddenly living in a new culture, having to adapt. You know, there's just so much about what happened that was good for me specifically. I don't think it's for everybody, but me specifically, easily distracted, wanting attention, you know, like suddenly being the kid from New York in a small Irish boarding school was actually kind of like exciting for me. So I kind of got everything I needed out of my Irish experience.
I find it interesting. You've held your accent. I would never sniff you out except when you say Ireland, as opposed to 3 syllables the way I would pronounce it.
Yeah, and there's other words if we were talking for a while. Also, if an Irish person suddenly sat next to me, like my accent would shift subconsciously, like I wouldn't make a decision, it would just happen. And then my accent actually has gotten New Yorkified again from being back in the States a lot more. There was a time where my New York friends used to make fun of me for having a bit of an Irish accent, but I never had more than a bit of an Irish accent. But I definitely had more than I have now.
Well, you went over there, what, early 90s, mid 90s?
1990.
90. All right. So that's when a lot of people were coming over from there to here to New York because of the economy, and the Irish were opening bars. I used to hang out at a bar called the Breffni on 40th and Queens.
Know it well.
Okay.
Know it well.
So the name of their softball team, and I didn't get it at first. And when I found out what it was, I was like, oh, that's interesting. They called themselves the Provos. They had Provos jerseys.
That's so funny because that's such a quintessential Irish American experience. Like so I have tons of jokes about coming to Ireland. The first joke I used to have was that there was a sign at the airport that said wrong way because I was the only American coming back to Ireland. Everybody was going the other way in reference to the first thing you said. But I also had a joke about how, I mean, it was a baptism of fire because, as you know, from the team being called the Provos, for those that don't know, the Provos was slang for the Provisional IRA, which in Irish America, you were raised to love the IRA. I mean, I was up the ra all of my childhood. And when I came to Ireland, to my great surprise, people in the Republic of Ireland were not, they did not support the IRA. In fact, they were kind of horrified by the whole thing. And I didn't get any fights, but I had a lot of arguments with people. I was kind of shocked. Obviously, I got educated and developed my own nuanced take on it. But the fact that you could call a softball team the Provos, that would not have been happening in Dublin in 1994, for example.
It's crazy to, it's almost like a hack station wagon kids in the back bit, but that the IRA would come to New York and just openly do fundraisers 30 years ago. Like, what?
Norade. Well, my parents were right in the thick of that. I mean, we were as Provo as they come, as far as Irish American families go. We had carvings of Celtic crosses that were made in Longkesh prison by IRA prisoners. We marched for County Down. See, my mother's father was from the North. My mother worked for O'Dwyer & Bernstein, a law firm that represented, fought against extradition of IRA members that were being held in American prisons. I mean, we were in the heart of pro-IRA Irish America. I mean, when we marched down Fifth Avenue, the signs were like, get the Brits out, Brits out. And like when we sold our house in 2015, when I cleaned out the attic, there was like, marching band instruments that we had been storing in our attic with Brits out and 26 plus 6 equals 1 stickers on them. And, I was kind of shocked, like as an adult man who spent actually most of his life in Ireland in the end, I was shocked at the just overtly Republican propaganda that I was raised around,
Yeah, and as an Irish American, we were into U2 when they were a little more political. Then a little later on, I'd go see Black 47 at Patty Riley's, and Larry would be up there singing this song.
Yeah, Larry Kerwin. And the funny thing is that Black 47 is a great band, actually, but very much an Irish American band. Irish. And he was from Wexford, actually, which is where I ended up going to boarding school for 3 years. I always say to Irish people, because I do jokes. I did a show about my mom, about after my mom died, I did like a one-man show about my mother. But I had a whole section about the Irish American Republican experience. And I make fun of myself for what happened when I came to Ireland, but I would definitely say that it's somewhere in the middle between the way I was raised as sort of a naive kind of Provo upbringing and the overly critical Irish people in the 80s and 90s that were perhaps overly critical of the IRA, perhaps didn't have an understanding of the complexities of the North. I would say it's probably somewhere in the middle of those two positions is the better position. And you know what's hilarious is that, well, it's not hilarious, but the young Irish people now, they're inclined to support Sinn Fein, which was the political party of the IRA, and they don't have the baggage from the Troubles. So young Irish people sort of look to them as a sort of an anti-establishment party that can fight against the housing crisis and all these issues that we have in the States too, but a different government gets blamed.
You're making me smile. I'm thinking about my mom, and it wasn't racism. It was some sort of tribalism that, you know, so-and-so, oh, they're not Irish, we don't like them. Okay, now they're Irish, but they're from the wrong county. Or, oh, the bishops, those greenhorns, we don't like that. You know, everything was wrong. You had to be like a first cousin or forget it.
Yeah, well, I actually have a company in Ireland, you know, like a limited company, and I called it Blowin Entertainment. Most people don't know the term Blowin, but in Ireland, it's a big term for somebody who lives in a place but isn't from there. And like, I'm a blow-in to Ireland, but like Irish people can be blow-ins if you move from one village to another, you know?
Yes.
So I called my company Blowin Entertainment, and there's a lot of that. Well, here's a funny story about you talking about like not racism or tribalism. This is how ignorant in a way my mother raised us, because I remember, do you remember the movie The Great Outdoors or The Mosquito Coast? Yeah. So there was two redheaded twins in those two movies. And we were working on a modeling job for them. We modeled as kids for Ford Modeling Agency. And the mother was Irish as far as I was concerned. I heard her accent. She was Irish. And my mother, after the conversation, the woman left. And I said, oh, she was a nice woman. And my mother said, yeah, but she's a Northern Irish Protestant. She put it right into my head that this person can't be a good person because she's a Protestant from the North. And I joke about that now to people because that's insane that she thought that was okay.
The other term that it's a bit of a hack bit, but you'll know where I'm going here. But when I was hanging out in those Irish bars, and the Irish would ask me if in New York City in the early 90s, if I wanted to go find some crack.
Yes.
That was a word loosely translated as let's go find good fun, not rock cocaine. Yeah,
CRAIC, which is not actually Irish, but it has become that. Like, it's not from the Irish language. That's like a fake etymology. It's just a word that's evolved out of. There's like 3 or 4 competing claims on the etymology of crack. However, these days, it's certainly not a Gaelga. It's not an Irish language word, but it is 100% the Irish word for fun. But because my wife is obsessed with crack now. Because when we first met,
that's my full quote, by the way. Hannah Berner is obsessed with crack.
But when we first met, I actually said to her, I said, one of the things that I immediately connected with is you don't know what the crack is, but like you have the crack. Like you are like quintessential crack, but you don't get it. She still can't explain it to people. And it's very hard to explain what the crack is, because the crack is not just almost like a way of being that can be hard to explain to people that aren't Irish. She actually got in trouble the other day because she posted a clip and kind of tried to suggest that Irish and English people are into this thing called crack. And the Irish were like, it has nothing to do with the English.
So it's the 21st century. We have to put labels on everything. Every article about you in the States calls you Irish comedian. To the Irish,
Irish American. Yeah.
Are you American comedian, Des Bishop? Like, because your style is, you know, if I had to graph you, you're closer to the Bill Burr end than the Tommy Tiernan end.
Yeah, but you know, if you watch my really early stuff, I was funny that I'm not inspired by Bill Burr at all, which is hilarious that I get a lot of comparisons to him now. However, I was very inspired by Tommy Tiernan in the early part of my career. And when I watch my bits from 2001, 2, 3, I can see Tommy's influence on my style. And these days, unfortunately, I just get the Bill Burr comparisons, I think, because we're both like middle-aged Northeastern guys with like a kind of and I've gone back to my de facto energy, which is kind of a Queens guy energy, working class Queens guy. That's not an artistic choice. That's just who I am, you know? In Ireland, it wasn't as obvious because I had a lot, not all, but a lot of material talking about Ireland and talking about the differences between America and Ireland, and also quite a keen awareness for a foreigner, as far as Irish were concerned, quite a keen awareness of like regional sensibilities and differences between Irish areas, and I could do the accents. So it's not that the Queen's energy is not as obvious in a lot of those bits because it's obviously like not coming from that. But these days, when I'm expressing my frustration with the modern world, frustration with the differences between generations, or my frustration with America in general, OG kind of Queen's energy comes out. And if you watch, like, I put my mother in a couple of things over the years, like documentaries and stuff. Like if you watch her energy, you go, oh, it's not Bill Burr that this guy's inspired by. It's Eileen Bishop. You know, she's pissed off about everything.
Yeah, I think my comparison there was about energy, and the current special is a little more rat-a-tat-tat than the bigger themes, the theme pieces, which is what I wanted to ask you about, that evolution there. Is it a choice? Is it just what you're feeling now, that it's less of a theme hour?
I think it's more a necessity as the mother of invention, like working in the States, working the clubs, doing 15-minute spots at the Cellar. I just, those long bits, you know, it's just like my 15-minute spot isn't going to be about one thing. Just going around America, like I'm just not going to get with bar staff floating around, people not knowing who you are. Like you just don't, I don't think you get the license to indulge in a theme in the same way. And I don't even like the fact that there's like a separation. Like people will be like, oh, it's like a Birbiglia type show. Obviously, I'm sure you know this side of the water, Birbiglia type comedy is just comedy. But so I don't even like the fact that there's two types. But for me, it's been, I think, like an upgrade to my skill level to have not been able to lean on that. Like, I think obviously there's tricks in every type of comedy, but I think that perhaps there have been too many times, not always, but too many times in my comedy career where I had the crutch of a theme, which gives you maybe too much freedom to not be as punchy as you would need to be in Philadelphia on a Saturday night at 10:30, you know?
Yeah. And in the age of social media, and you got to feed the beast and all that, and my audience is sick of me telling this, but the amount of times I'll be watching an hour and my wife shows up 36 minutes in, stands there for 5 seconds and goes, is this guy funny? And you know, I want to hit pause and be like, well, you see what he just did there. He set that up 18 minutes ago. So that's a throwback and a misdirect. And it's like, you know.
Oh, I mean, I have so many, like I had a great special back in 2008 called Tongues, and it was a 2-part special. One part was all about the Irish language, which is why I called it Tongues. The other part is just material that was relevant to Ireland at that time, which was actually right at the sort of an inkling that the world economy was about to crash, which is funny because it's a moment in time. But anyway, I have what I think is a very strong finishing sort of 15 minutes, but it's very interconnected and very woven. Like my punchline, my special finishes with a joke that makes absolutely no sense unless you've watched the first part of that 15 minutes. And so I had a lot of that back in the day. And I still think that stuff is great. One of the great things about, because that's the other thing when I said necessity is the mother of invention, clips being the currency of modern comedy, I obviously had to have jokes that stood alone. The great thing about clips is that if you can make clippable jokes work still within the confines of these great 15, 20-minute bits, essentially your 15, 20-minute bit still works the same as it used to. It's just so much better. That's what I think.
One more break and back with Des Bishop. You have a piece of crowd work in your current special that I will not spoil at all. But as soon as I hit play, I was like, oh, this is amazing. So that hopefully
that's not a spoiler. We could talk about that.
Okay. So for the audience, the clip opens up with crowd work and suddenly you burst into Mandarin. And I'm like, holy S, who is this guy? Well, this is amazing.
Well, your reaction is literally why that bit is there. And I really got to credit Shane Gillis because Hannah said, why don't you, and this wasn't like a Shane Gillis bit, but Shane Gillis on his YouTube special, I think, or maybe it was his Netflix special, he opens cold open to crowd work, or he cold opens to a bit. It's not like, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Shane Gillis. And that's very effective in the modern world where you just have to grab people's attention. So Hannah said, why don't you open with the Mandarin crowd work? And people will just be like, oh shit, this is not what I normally see. And that's why that exists. And obviously that bit, despite the fact that it sounds complicated, the crowd work of finding somebody that speaks Mandarin and joking with them in Mandarin, I mean, it works so well for me. In fact, one of the things that made my transition back to the States so much easier was because so much of my material about spending time in China, which obviously takes a bit of time to explain right now, we're just jumping into it, but the material I had from my experience in China really translated very easily to America. In fact, better in America than in Ireland. So I had no problem chucking that bit of crowd work up top because I know it's funny. It's funny without any awareness of China. It's got a pretty good punchline right at the end. And so everything you experience is by design.
Oh, it's amazing. So what makes you go to China to be a stand-up? And that's an aggressive play.
Yeah, I mean, again, that was one thing led to another, but the very quick list of reasons how I ended up in China was, one, I became very friendly with Chinese people on my first documentary project, which was about living on minimum wage. Two, it just so happened that the years leading up to that, I was actually studying Kung Fu with a Sifu from Hong Kong who took us to Chinese dim sum every Sunday afternoon and was very into teaching us about Chinese culture, which then helped me to connect with those Chinese people who brought me to China on a vacation in 2004. I was fascinated by China and its difference to the West. Separate to that, but at the same time, my neighborhood, which we've discussed, Flushing, Queens, became completely Chinese in my lifetime. And my next door neighbors, who I would shovel snow with if I was back visiting my parents, they couldn't speak English. And I really became fascinated with like trying to communicate with them. So then when I made a project in Ireland about learning the Irish language, which was a very Irish project, and everyone in Ireland has to learn Gaelic in school. So that was like an easy project to do in Ireland. But once I realized, I'm not bad at learning languages, I pitched the idea of doing that in China, to learn Chinese, to do stand-up in Mandarin. And that's the quickest version of a very long story about how I went to China.
Did you mentally write in Mandarin or did you write in English and translate it?
100% mentally wrote in Mandarin. In fact, people always say like it must be hard to come up with jokes, because they think of it in terms of translation. And people like Eddie Izzard, great guy, but he takes his show and figures it out in another language and then does it. And he's done that in numerous languages. But I was trying to do something else, which was I was trying to turn my experiences in China into stand-up. So actually, once I got somewhat a bit of an understanding about the language, I was able to use my basic Mandarin to tell my fish out of water stories. And the majority, I'd say only 20 or 30% of my jokes actually in Mandarin work in English. The ones that I do in the special are ones that work in English. Some of them don't actually work in Mandarin because they're just different. But most of my stuff in Mandarin works, not because of translation, but because it's about things that are about China. They don't make sense in English, or they don't make sense to people that haven't been to China.
So is it more storytelling? Is it rat-a-tat-tat? Or is it, I don't know, I didn't know how to use the laundry machines and they find humor that the white guy didn't know what to do?
I mean, you can be sure, because the difficulty level is pretty high, that I leaned on the easier topics, fish out of water, mispronunciation jokes, just, I guess, the entry level things you find funny as somebody who moves to China and tries to learn Mandarin and is clearly not Chinese. You're a white guy, you stand out, all those things. So I leaned on that as much as possible. And then some basic observations, just jokes about like the stress around Chinese New Year and, things that are like, I would say maybe next level observations, not as simple, but like Chinese people are impressed that you notice that, and And that's about as far as I got in terms of like the difficulty level of my Chinese humor. Like I was only able to tell the jokes that I could with my basic level of Mandarin and my basic understanding of Chinese life.
What kind of rooms are these? By the way, the sound effects for this episode I'm so glad you're outside. I'm so glad you explained the fireworks and the dog, because this is going to sound amazing as a pod. I'm loving it. What kind of rooms?
I'm so embarrassed, actually. The whole thing is very embarrassing. But I guess it's interesting because Hannah had no idea that Halloween was the fireworks time. Well, at my time in China, the rooms were bar shows because it's not a thing. You know, it wasn't like stand-up was like a new thing in China. And it was these small pockets in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Chengdu of people that were like seeing it on the internet, Western people doing stand-up, and some nerdy comedy fans were like, you know, putting the Chinese Mandarin subtitles at the bottom, and they were seeing like clips from the Oscars and clips from the Tonight Show and thinking, oh, let's do that. So I was in the very early stages of that. So that's largely the types of rooms I was doing was that. Joe Wong, I don't know if you ever interviewed him, but he actually made his career in the States. He's from China, Chinese immigrant to the United States, but did really well doing stand-up in English, did a couple of really big Letterman sets, and really was amazing stand-up, to be honest, like really astute observations. But again, a little fish out of water, but classic Chinese guy, play on words, a little mathematical. Anyway, he blew up because he roasted Joe Biden when he was vice president, and it went viral in China. So viral that he went back to China to because he was famous. And he's had quite the career in China since I was there, actually, since that time. And the only big shows I did were opening up for him, but he was doing stand-up in Mandarin. But he was struggling with doing stand-up in Mandarin as much as I was, because his comedy brain was very much fish out of water, comedy in English about being in America. He had to almost find a different identity, speaking as a Chinese person from the northeast of China, just speaking about modern China. So that was the only time I did like a theater, was with him.
Were you worried about the censors? And obviously you're not going to lose your mind and get up and, you know, do 5 minutes about the government, but are you worried about maybe stepping on something you don't even know is a landmine culturally?
I mean, yeah, you would definitely worry about stepping on a landmine in terms of like being that in the room that night. I mean, you're definitely not going to, you're not going to be the asshole who, you know, does stuff that's going to make the crowd uncomfortable because they think that this is too subversive in a place where that's not safe. You can touch on stuff. I made a joke in the actual show about one of the great things about China is comedy is always about finding the line and just crossing it just a little bit. But a lot of times you don't know where the line is. Like we're joking about Tony Hinchcliffe, like he totally misjudged the line and now there's chaos, right? Whereas in China, the line is very clear. Things you don't talk about, and if you do, you go to jail. The joke is always 3 T's, Tiananmen, Tibet, Taiwan. But I wasn't interested in causing any trouble. It wasn't my job. I mean, I could go on about this topic for a long time, but it's gotten a lot worse in China since I was there. So actually, there's even less freedom of speech there than when I was there. But what I will say is that stand-up in itself, it's kind of subversive there in the sense that our Western style stand-up is individualistic, and it's like often, not always, but often personal. You're speaking about your life in a way that wouldn't be quintessential Asian culture. And these young men and women that are going up there and joking about their difficult relationships with their parents, breaking Chinese cultural norms, not political stuff, but breaking Chinese cultural norms, talking about dating, stuff like that in China is actually, it's pretty subversive. It's pretty challenging to the audience in a way that we don't appreciate because we're post sexual revolution. We're post being able to criticize religion. We're going backwards, but largely we live in a situation where we can say whatever we want without fear of, upsetting people to the point that it's going to cause our lives, more issues than being canceled, right? So the whole thing was more impressive than it sounds when you say, oh, well, I couldn't joke about the government or I couldn't talk about Tiananmen or Tibet,
I'll head for home here. You've been very generous with your time. My daughter was snooping my calendar. She texted me. She's like, I saw on your calendar you're talking to Des Bishop. Do you know who he's married to? She's in her early 20s. I'm like, yes, but I'm not going to ask 45 minutes of questions about Hannah. But she was very excited. Are you seeing an audience pick up in the States because of the podcast?
I mean, honestly, there was an immediate pickup just from my association with Hannah. And the more popular she got, the more I would get people that would support me because they became aware of me through Hannah originally. But that was usually just like a small group. The podcast a little bit, but I really feel that the bigger thing has been the clips. I mean, there's definitely some podcast people, but the clips have been the bigger thing. But I think that some of those clips probably went more viral because people were like sharing them because they were like, this is Hannah's husband. So without a doubt, there has been positive career associations with being married to Hannah. But I must point out that when I met Hannah, she had only done a year of stand-up. Stand-up had been stopped because of COVID. And, it was a very different time in her career. And actually, because, the reality stuff finished so like stressfully, it wasn't an immediate sense of, wow, this has been amazing for my career. It was more like, wow, this has been very difficult for my mental health.
Are you a stand-up for life? Do you want to act? And I'm asking that because you've got great hair game.
Well, it's not that great today. I did go to the gym and have a shower, but I did not brush my hair nor blow dry it. But sorry. I mean, there was always in my mind, like I would love to do movies, but I never wanted to do auditions or put in the hard yards because, well, I think not all, but a lot of stand-ups are kind of like, not control freaks, but you just get used to sort of like making your own work, putting your own work on. And there's a freedom to that. Acting is very much like wait and see. So I always kind of hoped that something would like fall in my lap. A couple of things have, but not to any huge extent. And I have done plenty of auditions throughout the years, but nothing easy ever came my way. So yes, I would still act, but stand up and writing and, you want to know the truth, actually. I always thought that as I got older, I would settle into radio, but the industry just changed. So actually,
me too. I'm doing a podcast in the basement.
Yeah. So, and I still go and do radio interviews, and I got actually before I turned down 2 pretty good radio offers to go to China. Just coincidentally enough, I filled in for 2 Irish radio presenters on 2 different radio stations, and they both offered me quite good jobs after filling in for the week. And at both of those offers, I just was like, listen, I'm going to China. And I saw that as something for a little bit later in my life. I just didn't know that within the next decade that industry would change, and also that I would want to spend a bit more time in the States. So I wasn't looking for like an Irish radio job, but I do like the formality of 5 days a week on the radio, producer, a bit of focus, time in the office. Like I think podcasting is slowly kind of essentially becoming that, but I haven't found that model, and I miss the way it used to be in that, not all areas of the industry, but I do miss that type of focus.
It was fun. A big bulk of my career was producing radio shows. And just like you're saying, the relationship between a producer and a host, and especially like if I'm producing you and I'm giving you the side, like we have to have that circle of trust of like, dude, you're going off the rails here. Trust me. I'm on this. Like, trust me, and giving you, and I'm doing it out of habit on the video here, giving you hand signals or, hey, wrap it up or you're going to hang yourself here. Get out of this. Let's go. Yeah. Radio's dead.
It is. But what I do think will happen, because I always say to Hannah, because Hannah's like a very good podcaster and I guess somewhat of a pioneer female podcaster. She certainly was pretty early into the game, but I feel that over time, some of that formality will return because the money is there. And I think to maintain an audience, the standards have to be there. The sense of fresh ideas, keeping it interesting. Like a lot of podcasts are great, but they're like a moment in time. And then when that moment passes, then it's like, where do we go from here? Like all that stuff will naturally be necessary. So I do think that some of the formality of the way it used to be will come back. And the last thing I always say to Hannah is the one thing podcasting is really lacking is the sense of it's happening right now.
Yeah.
And for certain issues, certain types of radio, I think that still has value. And I think that will be the next evolution, is a better way of listening live other than, oh, this podcaster goes live on YouTube, but it's not the same.
Yeah, no, it's not the same. It will not surprise me if I used to work at Sirius, if they open up a bag of cash for Hannah and she winds up with a station and they pay well. Just say yes.
Well, as it turns out, they actually didn't give Hannah a great offer, but Hannah's doing fine. But Sirius was one of the low ballers, actually.
Really?
Well, I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. I probably shouldn't have said that. But anyway, whatever. Such is life.
Appreciate your time today, man. This was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Wasn't he fantastic? I loved him. I could have talked to him for another hour, but, you ask for 20 minutes and you keep 45. Yeah, you got to let people go at some point. But he was so easy to talk to. Des Bishop, his special is called Of All People. You will find it on YouTube. See you back here tomorrow.